England, 1940. The world was burning. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, and every night the horizon glowed red as German bombers set cities ablaze. The British Royal Air Force was outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. Planes fell faster than they could be built. The factories worked day and night, but the skies demanded more than production. They demanded miracles. And somewhere in the wreckage of a bombed airfield, amid twisted steel and smoldering hangars, one man, a ground mechanic named Reginald Reggie Wallace, found the unthinkable, the shattered remains of a plane that could no longer fly. Everyone else saw scrap metal, but to him it was the skeleton of something that might save Britain. This is the forgotten story of the mad mechanic who rebuilt a junk plane with his bare hands and turned it into a legend of the skies. Reggie Wallace was never meant to be a hero. He wasn't a pilot or a commander or a man of rank. He was a grease-stained technician, the kind who worked until dawn, hands black with oil, fixing the machines others would fly into glory. He grew up in the shadow of airfields, fascinated not by flight, but by the heartbeat of engines, by how something human could defy gravity with the right combination of fire and steel. When the war began, he joined the Royal Air Force not to fight, but to keep others flying. It was dirty work, thankless work, but for Reggie, it was sacred. If the pilots are the soul of the sky, he once said, then the mechanics are the bones that lift them. By 1940, that sky had turned into hell. The Battle of Britain raged above him. German bombers crossed the channel in endless waves, and every day Reggie watched pilots climb into cockpits, knowing some wouldn't come back. When the sirens wailed, he didn't run for cover. He stayed in the hangars, shielding engines with his own body, patching bullet holes in wings even as bombs fell around him. Sleep was a luxury. Food came in cold tins. The only constant sound was the drone of engines and the scream of the air raid alarm. Then one night everything changed. A German raid tore through his base outside Kent. The blast flattened hangars, destroyed tools, and reduced half the runway to a crater. When the smoke cleared, Reggie found what used to be a fighter plane, a Hawker Hurricane, ripped open like a tin can. Its wings were shredded, the fuselage snapped, the cockpit glass melted into the frame. The other mechanics wrote it off immediately. "She's finished," one said. "That thing'll never fly again." But Reggie didn't answer. He just stared at the wreckage, tracing its twisted edges with his fingers like a surgeon examining a dying patient. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. While others slept, he dragged the wrecked Hurricane into what was left of the hangar and covered it with a tarp. The plane was beyond repair, missing parts, burnt components, no factory support. But Reggie couldn't stop thinking, if we can't build new planes fast enough, maybe we can rebuild the ones we've lost. It was madness. He had no authorization, no proper tools, and barely enough materials to fix one wing. But war doesn't wait for permission. For weeks, he worked in secret. He scavenged parts from wrecks scattered around the airfield. A rudder from one, a tail assembly from another, a canopy salvaged from a downed Spitfire. Each night he pieced together fragments of destroyed aircraft into something entirely new. An aircraft that had no name, no origin, and no manual. It was a Frankenstein's creation of war, held together by rivets, luck, and sheer determination. The others laughed. "You've gone mad, Reggie," they said. "That heap won't even taxi." But he didn't care. He worked through the cold, through the blackout nights, guided by the dim glow of a lantern. Every hammer strike echoed like a heartbeat. Every bolt tightened felt like defiance. He whispered to the plane as he worked, talking to it like an old friend coming back to life. "Come on, girl," he'd mutter. "You've still got one more fight left in you." And as days turned into nights and nights into weeks, the impossible began to take shape. The twisted fuselage straightened. The engine, rebuilt from 4 different wrecks, sputtered, coughed, and roared back to life. When it did, the sound stopped everyone on the airfield. Men turned. Silence fell. The junk plane, the one they'd called a coffin, was alive again. Its patched metal gleamed in the moonlight, the smell of burning oil filling the air. Reggie stood by the cockpit, eyes burning from fatigue, hands trembling. Not from fear, but from disbelief. Against every rule of logic, he had done it. A mechanic had built a fighter out of ruin. It wasn't perfect. The left wing still bore holes. The frame was heavier. The instruments mismatched. But it was real. And somewhere deep down, he knew it was more than just a machine. It was proof that even in a world shattered by war, a man could still create something beautiful. What he didn't know was that soon that same junk plane would be the only thing standing between a German bomber squadron and a defenseless city, and that his madness was about to become legend. The morning after Reggie's creation came to life, the airfield buzzed with disbelief. Mechanics stood around the patched-up Hurricane shaking their heads. "She'll shake apart the moment she leaves the ground," one muttered. "It's suicide," said another. The higher-ups didn't even bother inspecting it. To them, it was just another wreck cluttering the hangar. But to Reggie, it was the beating heart of hope. Fragile, imperfect, but alive. He knew it wasn't enough to make the engine roar. He had to prove it could fly. And that meant finding someone reckless enough to try. Most pilots refused. The Hurricane looked like a grave waiting for a name. Its mismatched panels, uneven wings, and riveted scars gave it the look of something built by desperation, not design. Then came Flight Lieutenant Arthur Grant, a quiet, stubborn man who had lost his own aircraft just a week earlier. He stared at the plane for a long time, running his hand along its patched frame. "She's ugly," he said finally, "but she's British. Let's see if she can still bite." Reggie wanted to stop him. He wasn't ready. Not yet. But the war didn't wait for perfection. German bombers had been spotted over the channel again, and the airfield was running out of flyable planes. There was no time left to argue. So Reggie watched as Grant strapped himself into the cockpit, the same seat that hours ago had been covered in ash and soot. His heart pounded as he primed the engine, praying it wouldn't explode. The air filled with smoke. The patched engine coughed, sputtered, and then, to everyone's shock, thundered to life. The plane trembled violently, like a creature waking from a nightmare. The mechanics stepped back, covering their ears as propeller blades cut through the mist. The ground shook under the power of the impossible machine. And before anyone could stop him, Grant pushed the throttle forward. The Hurricane lurched down the runway, wobbling, spitting black smoke. Reggie ran alongside it, shouting over the roar, "Come on, girl! Hold together." For a moment, it seemed it would collapse. The right wing dipped, the landing gear buckled, and then, in a miracle that no one believed possible, it lifted. Slowly, painfully, but defiantly, the plane rose into the gray morning sky. Every man on the airfield froze, watching the impossible unfold. Against the clouds, the patched-together Hurricane climbed higher, its uneven wings gleaming in the dim sunlight. The sound it made wasn't smooth. It was raw, guttural, uneven. But it was flying. The mad mechanic's dream was airborne. Reggie's chest tightened with a mix of pride and terror. It wasn't supposed to work, but it did. Minutes passed, then the radio crackled. "She's light on the stick," Grant's voice came through, calm but strained. "Little shaky, but she flies." A cheer erupted across the airfield. Mechanics jumped, laughed, hugged. Even the officers who had mocked Reggie could only stare in awe. But the celebration didn't last long, because just then, the warning siren wailed again. German bombers, a formation of Heinkels, were approaching fast. The airfield scrambled what few planes they had left, but most were grounded, under repair, or destroyed. Only one fighter was ready to intercept: Reggie's rebuilt Hurricane. There was no time for hesitation. Grant's voice came again through the static. "Tell your mechanic he built himself a fighter." Reggie's hands clenched into fists as he watched the lone aircraft veer toward the horizon. The sky above England darkened with the incoming wave of bombers. Black specks grew larger, the hum of engines building into a low, thunderous growl. Against them flew one patchwork machine, half scrap, half miracle. The control tower fell silent. Everyone held their breath. Reggie could barely hear anything over the pounding of his heart. He had built this plane from nothing. Now its life, and a man's life, hung on every bolt, every weld, Every improvised part he had stitched together in the dark. Minutes turned to hours. No one spoke. Then, faintly, over the radio, the sound of gunfire, then Grant's voice again. One down. Two. Static. Then silence. Reggie stood frozen. He looked at the empty sky and felt the weight of every moment he'd doubted himself. Had it held together? Had it fallen apart midair? Was his dream about to become his guilt? The airfield waited. Every man's eyes were on the horizon. And then, a faint speck appeared, smoke trailing from the tail, wings shuddering but still intact. The hurricane was returning. The impossible had not only flown, it had fought. When the plane touched down, its left wheel collapsed, sliding across the mud. But it didn't matter. It had done the unthinkable. One mad mechanic had built a fighter from ruins, and that fighter had taken down 2 bombers in its first flight. Reggie rushed toward it as Grant climbed out of the cockpit, face blackened, eyes wide with adrenaline. He didn't speak. He just patted the side of the plane and said, "She's ugly as hell, Wallace, but she flies like a devil." And in that moment, as the airfield erupted into cheers, Reggie realized this wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a message, a defiance written in metal and oil. Britain would not bow, but war is cruel to miracles. And the more Reggie's plane flew, the more it drew attention, not just from the enemy above, but from the very command that had once ignored him. The question was no longer whether the plane could fight, but whether they would let it. In the weeks that followed, Reggie Wallace's creation became a legend, whispered through hangars and airfields. Mechanics called it the Ghost Hurricane. Pilots touched its patched fuselage for lead luck before taking off. Every flight it survived, every enemy it brought down, turned into rumor, myth, and hope. The kind of story men clung to when the nights grew cold and the raids never stopped. But legends are dangerous things during war. They threaten the pride of those in command. By early autumn, reports of Reggie's modified Hurricane had reached headquarters. Officers who had once dismissed him now wanted answers and control. One gray morning, a staff car arrived at the airfield. Inside were 2 officials from the Ministry of Aircraft Production. They wore polished boots, crisp uniforms, and expressions that suggested they had already made up their minds. Reggie stood at attention as one of them inspected the patched-up fighter like a museum exhibit. "This," he said, his voice dripping with disbelief, "isn't regulation. Unauthorized modifications, non-standard materials, reassembled parts from 3 different models." He looked up at Reggie. "This is a death trap." Reggie's jaw tightened. "Sir," he said quietly, "this death trap has brought down 7 German bombers." The officer frowned, unimpressed. "Luck. Nothing more. And luck has no place in His Majesty's Air Force." The order was simple and devastating. The Ghost Hurricane was to be grounded, stripped, and scrapped. Reggie's work, his nights of sweat and fire and fear, would be erased. The airfield fell silent as he read the notice. Around him, men who had cheered for him days ago could only look away. Regulations had won. Innovation had lost. That night, the mechanic sat alone beside his machine. The hangar lights flickered in the smoky air. He traced his hand along the patched steel, every scar a memory of a battle fought not just in the sky, but on the ground, between those who dared to try and those who feared to fail. He remembered the first time he'd heard the engine roar to life, the way the propellers had sliced the morning fog, the way it had lived. Reggie wasn't a soldier, he was a builder. But even builders have limits, and orders were orders, or at least they were supposed to be. The next night, as bombs began to fall once again over the coast, the sirens wailed across the base. Pilots scrambled for their planes, but half the aircraft were down for repairs, the rest were out of fuel. The sky was burning, and Britain's defenses were crumbling. Reggie watched from the hangar as tracer fire streaked across the clouds. He could hear the faint cries over the radio, pilots calling for backup that wasn't coming. His hands trembled. He looked at the Ghost Hurricane, grounded, condemned, but ready. Its patched wings seemed to whisper through the wind, "You built me for this." Without thinking, Reggie made his choice. He ran for the cockpit. The mechanics shouted after him, but he didn't stop. He had spent months giving this plane a soul, Now he would give it one more fight. He fired the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared with that same stubborn growl that had once shaken the airfield. The hangar filled with smoke and light. Outside, the officers arrived too late. The wheels lifted, the plane soared, and the mad mechanic was gone, flying into the storm he had helped others survive. The radio crackled with disbelief. "Who's flying that hurricane?" a voice demanded. No answer, only static, then the sound of wind rushing past the microphone. Reggie wasn't trained to fly, but he knew the machine better than anyone alive. Every vibration, every sound, every weakness. He wasn't fighting as a pilot, he was fighting as a creator defending his creation. He spotted the German formation, Heinkels and Dorniers moving in a diamond pattern against the full moon. Searchlights caught their bellies, glinting silver. Reggie adjusted the throttle, his hands steady despite the shaking. He aimed straight for the bombers, heart pounding, eyes burning with smoke and fear. The first pass was chaos. Bullets ripped through the wings. The controls shuddered violently. But Reggie stayed on course, firing the plane's guns until the barrels glowed red. One bomber peeled off, engines ablaze. Then another. The night sky lit up with fire. He felt the hurricane tremble beneath him, panels tearing, fuel leaking, wings straining against the wind. The engine howled like a living thing in pain, but it kept flying. He had built it too stubborn to die. Down below, the airfield watched in stunned silence as a lone, battered fighter tore through the German formation. The officers who had ordered its destruction stood speechless. No one could deny what they were seeing. The ghost hurricane, the machine they had called illegal, impossible, was saving them all. As dawn broke, the last of the bombers retreated across the channel. Smoke curled across the horizon. The airfield was still standing, but the radio was silent. No one knew if Reggie had made it back. For hours they searched the sky calling his name. Nothing. Only the distant hum of engines fading into the clouds. And then, just as the sun broke over the hangars, someone spotted it, a speck on the horizon trailing smoke. The ghost hurricane limped back home, its wings cracked, its frame shaking apart. It touched down hard, skidding across the runway in a shower of sparks before collapsing into stillness. The canopy opened. Reggie Wallace climbed out, his face streaked with oil, his eyes filled with exhaustion and relief. The mechanics rushed to him, shouting, laughing, crying. He had done what no one believed possible. But before anyone could speak, the senior officer approached. He looked at the wrecked fighter, then at the man who had built it. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said quietly. Reggie nodded. "Aye, sir," he replied. "But if I hadn't, we'd all be ashes now." The officer stared at him for a long moment. Then he saluted. "You saved this base, Wallace. But don't expect a medal. This never happened." Reggie looked at the wreckage. Twisted, broken, but glorious, he smiled faintly. "Doesn't need to, sir." She flew. And as the sun rose over the battered airfield, the mad mechanic stood beside the ruins of his miracle. The plane that wasn't supposed to exist, but changed everything for those who saw it fly. Yet deep inside, Reggie knew that the war would not remember him. Machines could be rebuilt. Men like him were forgotten. But sometimes that's how legends begin. The morning after the raid, the base was quiet in a way that only comes after surviving death. The air still smelled of burnt oil and cordite. The ground was littered with shell casings and tire marks and fragments of planes that never made it back. But among the wreckage, one miracle stood out. The ghost hurricane. Torn apart, yes, barely held together by bolts and faith. Yet it had done the impossible. It had fought the Luftwaffe alone, and won. For a few days, Reggie Wallace was a silent legend. Mechanics whispered his name like a prayer. Pilots saluted him when they passed. Even the officers, those same men who had tried to ground his creation, couldn't meet his eyes. The paperwork that should have condemned him vanished in some quiet act of respect or fear. But word travels fast in war, faster than truth, faster than loyalty. Within weeks, London caught wind of the mechanic who flew his own fighter. The story spread through air bases and mess halls. Twisted, exaggerated, distorted. Some called him a hero. Others called him a reckless fool who endangered an entire squadron. And the higher it climbed up the chain of command, the more dangerous it became. By October 1940, Reggie was summoned to Whitehall. The ministry wanted answers. They wanted the blueprint of the Ghost Hurricane. Every measurement, every modification, every deviation from official design. They called it a review, but Reggie knew better. They weren't there to celebrate him. They were there to own his miracle. He stood before a long oak table surrounded by men in uniforms and suits. Maps lined the walls, red pins spreading across Europe like wounds. The lad engineer, a man who hadn't seen a battlefield in his life, adjusted his spectacles. Mr. Wallace, he said, we've examined your modifications. Some of them show promise, but your methods were crude, unorthodox, borderline unsafe. Reggie's voice stayed calm, but his hands trembled behind his back. Unsafe saved lives, sir. Regulation didn't. A silence fell over the room. One of the generals leaned forward, eyes cold. You're a mechanic, not a designer. You don't make decisions that affect the Crown's aircraft. Reggie stared at him. With respect, sir, I make them fly. The general slammed his fist on the table. And that's exactly what makes you dangerous. That was the moment Reggie realized what kind of war he was fighting now. Not against Germany, against the machine of bureaucracy itself, men who feared ideas they couldn't control. The ministry confiscated the Ghost Hurricanes, smile faintly and say, I fixed planes, that's all. But sometimes when a distant rumble of a jet echoed overhead, he'd look up at the sky and his eye would light up, as if seeing an old friend. One evening a letter arrived. It bore the seal of the Air Ministry. Inside was a simple message. Your technical notes on the hurricane have recently been reviewed for historical preservation. We would like to invite you to visit the RAF Museum as a guest of honor. Reggie stared at the letter for a long time. The world had changed. Faster, louder, brighter, but the sound of engines still stirred something inside him. Days later, he stood once more inside a hangar, surrounded by aircraft gleaming under the museum lights. And there it was, a restored Hurricane, the same model he had once rebuilt from scrap. A plaque beside it read, in honor of the unsung engineers whose hands kept Britain's wings in the squad. No one there knew that one of those unsung engineers was standing just a few feet away. Reggie didn't correct them. He didn't need to. The recognition wasn't in words or ceremonies. It was in the machine itself. The sound of the engine echoing softly in the hangar, as if it remembered him too. He reached out, touching the cold metal of the wing. For a brief second, he was back in 1940, hearing the bombs, feeling the vibration of his tools, smelling the oil and fire. He closed his eyes and whispered, You were never junk, were you? The museum guide approached him gently. Beautiful aircraft, isn't she? Reggie smiled. She always was. When he died years later, his obituary was only a few lines long. Reginald Wallace, 1912 to 1983. Aircraft mechanic, Royal Air Force. Survived by his family. No mention of the Ghost Hurricane. No medals. No recognition. Just a quiet goodbye to a man who had once dared to dream in a world torn apart by war. But history has its own way of remembering. In 1989, during the digital restoration of World War II records, a historian stumbled upon photographs of a strange hurricane with reinforced wings in an experimental propeller. Unlisted, unnamed. The restoration team labeled it the Wallace prototype. And just like that, the forgotten mechanic became a legend once more. Today, aviation experts still debate the origins of certain mid-war modifications found in RAF aircraft. No one can fully trace where they came from. But those who've read the old reports know the truth. Somewhere in the ashes of war, a single mechanic refused to follow the rules. And in doing so, he changed the sky forever. Because real heroes aren't always the ones in cockpits or command posts. Sometimes they're the ones with grease on their hands, working in the shadows, believing that even broken things, even junk, can still fly. And if you listen closely on a quiet day at the museum, you might just hear it. The faint echo of a hurricane engine roaring to life again, carrying the legacy of the mad mechanic who turned junk into a miracle.